Hey everyone, in this video we're going to be turning ultramarine violet pigment into a gouache paint and painting with it. The pigment I'm using is from Bössner's pigment line, which is a slightly more affordable line of pigments. And this is a pigment that I've had since forever, but I've never turned it into a gouache paint before. I've made casein paint from it, but that's about it. Ultramarine violet is a semi-old pigment which was invented in the 1870s as an offshoot of artificial ultramarine, which was invented in 1826, which was a rather major event in the history of pigments. Ultramarine violet is rather granulating and has a semi-high tinting strength. Not nearly as great as dioxazine violet, but the advantage of ultramarine violet as opposed to dioxazine violet is that ultramarine violet is light fast. So it's one of the few nice purples that you have available on your palette that does not fade over time. I'm starting out by mixing the pigment and the binder in approximately a 1-to-1 ratio, slightly less binder than pigment, because I like to start with as little binder as possible to make sure that the paint is super pigmented. And then I'll add extra binder later in case it needs it. The binder consists of gum arabic, distilled water and glycerin, 4 parts gum arabic to 1 part glycerin, and then a few drops of clove oil to act as a preservative. The amount of distilled water can vary. I like to add 2/3 the amount of distilled water to the amount of gum arabic and glycerin, just so that the binder has a nice, slightly watery consistency that incorporates well with the pigment. And of course, by the way, you should always wear a dust mask when handling pigments, because even though you're not handling a toxic pigment, ultramarine violet is not toxic, it's never safe to breathe in pigment dust, so it's better to be safe than sorry. I always try not to agitate the pigment when handling it in the beginning when mixing it with the binder. It's very important to try and mix it with the liquid quickly and without fussing too much about it, because that way you will avoid as much as possible having pigment dust in the air. And here I'm going in with the glass muller. In order to get a nice paint, it has to be exposed to shearing force, which is like the force that is exerted between the blades of a scissor, and that is what the muller does when you grind it in circles on the glass plate. And the goal of mulling the paint is to disperse the pigment in the binder so that every pigment particle is covered with binder. And here I'm adding first up some glucose and then some talc or hydrated magnesium silicate. What glucose does is that it attracts the moisture in the air so that your finished paint will not dry into a hardened lump that is really hard to re-wet. You could also use honey, but I prefer glucose as the quality doesn't vary as much from year to year as honey. And what talc does in paint is that talc doesn't give the paint opacity, but it alters the consistency so that it gets thicker and more painterly than watercolor. And it's what changes it from a watercolor into a gouache. That and the amount of pigment you add. And when the mulling is done, I just transfer the paint to a sterile plastic bag so that it's easy to pipe into pans. And here are the finished paint pans after layering and drying. And here's a swatch of the final paint. The bright purple of this paint reminded me of Dragon Age, the Veilguard, which was not out yet at the time when I painted this, and I was really looking forward to it. And I had just seen the Warrior gameplay demo with that cool elf with the nice long hair and the very well made hair physics, which we saw for the very first time in Dragon Age, so I really wanted to paint her. One of the advantages of this paint is that since it's so granulating, the paint doesn't really sink into the paper. It kind of sits on the surface of the paper, and you can just wet the paper and then blot off the paint in order to actually get back to the white of the paper. So I didn't have to use any white at all for this drawing. And it was easy to erase, sketch it out first and then erase the sketch lines. Also, I was using this drawing to kind of practice and get back into the Dragon Age style, which I've always loved. I love how good they are at shape appeal. Even though they're not the most realistic designs, the world of Dragon Age is always so visually appealing, and I really love that. But I'm not really into the super cartoony direction that they're going with the Veilguard. I kind of think Inquisition looks better, to be honest. I tried to capture as much detail of the armor and accessories as I could without going overboard and being super detailed and taking hours and hours to complete the sketch. This took about an hour and a half. And here's the finished result, made with only ultramarine violet gouache. I'm actually kind of impressed by the value range you get with this paint. I kind of expected it to be mid to light range only, but I think the dark areas are decent. And that's it. See you in the next video.